Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today, we drift back into the fog-choked streets of Victorian London, a city both magnificent and monstrous, gleaming with wealth and grandeur on one side, while drowning in squalor and desperation on the other. To walk these streets in the 19th century was to experience a world of contrasts so stark that one could scarcely believe the extremes belonged to the same city. The gas lamps flickered through thick clouds of smoke rising from countless chimneys, illuminating cobblestones slick with mud and sewage, while the distant clatter of carriage wheels and the rustle of silk skirts spoke of a prosperity that seemed impossibly far away for those in the shadows. London was at once a jewel of the empire and a breeding ground for the poorest of the poor, and nowhere was this duality more evident than in the hidden, narrow alleys where the crawlers made their lives. The term crawler was not an official designation, but rather a colloquial one, whispered by those who walked the streets at night, who witnessed the struggle and ingenuity of those who eked out survival by whatever means necessary. Crawlers were the invisible population, the unnoticed pulse beneath the visible heartbeat of London. They were men, women, and children who lived on the margins, navigating a world that was unforgiving, relentless, and often indifferent. Their existence was defined not by ambition or wealth, but by survival, by cunning, and by the ability to move silently and cleverly through the labyrinth of streets, alleys, and wharves that made up the city's lower quarters. These were the people who kept the city alive, though the city rarely acknowledged them. They scavenged refuse, begged for pennies, sold small wares, and occasionally turned to crime, not out of malice, but necessity. To truly understand the life of a crawler, one must first imagine the city itself. Victorian London was enormous, sprawling over the banks of the Thames, with its river acting both as a lifeline and a dumping ground. Factories belched smoke and soot into the air, making the sky a permanent gray and the streets sticky with grime. Horse-drawn carts and carriages navigated streets paved unevenly with cobblestones, leaving behind a mess of horse manure, mud, and debris. The sounds of the city were deafening: the roar of steam engines, the hammering of construction, the cries of street vendors, the wail of children, and the distant clanging of church bells. Through all this chaos moved the crawlers, often barely noticed, yet constantly observing, calculating, and adapting. Children were particularly emblematic of the crawler's life. Street urchins, often no older than 6 or 7, were everywhere. Their small hands clutched bundles of matches, pins, or small trinkets, which they sold to passers-by for a penny or two. Some ran errands for shopkeepers or factories, delivering messages, carrying parcels, or fetching coal. Others roamed the streets scavenging for discarded food or lost coins. Their faces were smudged with soot and dirt, their clothes ragged, yet their eyes were sharp, alert, and daring. In an era before child labor laws or social welfare, these children were forced into a precocious adulthood. Many had lost parents or guardians to disease, poverty, or the harsh conditions of slum life, and the streets themselves became their home, their school, and their battleground. They were survivors of circumstance, hardened by the daily struggle, and often exhibiting a streetwise cunning that astonished even the adults around them. Adult crawlers were no less resourceful. Men who could not find work in factories or docks often turned to scavenging or informal trades. They collected waste, sold scrap metal, or carried goods across town for a few pence. Some engaged in petty theft or pickpocketing, though not all crawlers were criminals. Many simply worked the margins of legal society to survive. Women, similarly, were often forced to rely on street trades, selling small items, begging, or performing services for those willing to pay. Single mothers, widows, and abandoned women found themselves in a precarious world, balancing the need to provide for their children with the constant threat of exploitation, illness, and violence. Disease was rampant. Cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid claimed thousands, and access to proper medical care was rare for those living in the slums. The crawlers existed in a constant dance with danger, where each day could bring minor triumphs or sudden disaster. The living conditions of these people were grim. The slums, often located near factories or along the riverbanks, were overcrowded, dark, and unsanitary. Families crammed into single rooms, sharing limited space and resources with strangers and extended kin. Sewage flowed openly through the streets, and clean water was scarce, forcing residents to make do with polluted wells or the river itself. Fires, always a risk in the dense wooden structures, could destroy entire neighborhoods in moments, leaving hundreds homeless overnight. In this environment, the crawlers adapted. They created networks of support, relied on the charity of others in their own communities, and developed strategies to find food, shelter, and protection. Survival required vigilance, intelligence, and courage, often in equal measure. Despite the hardships, there was a rhythm to crawler life. Morning brought the sounds of market stalls opening, factory whistles signaling the start of labor, and the first timid cries of children seeking coins from well-dressed passers-by. Midday was the bustle of trade, of streets crowded with people, of carts trundling over uneven cobblestones. Evening brought darker challenges. Curfews imposed by authorities increased crime, and the creeping cold of damp streets. Nighttime was both a danger and an opportunity. Some crawlers roamed the streets in darkness to scavenge or steal, while others took shelter in makeshift homes, attics, or abandoned buildings. Their existence was one of constant adaptation. They had to read the city as a map of opportunity and threat, knowing which streets were safe, which alleys to avoid, and which figures represented danger or potential aid. The social attitudes of the time added another layer of complexity. Victorian society was deeply hierarchical, and the wealthy and middle classes often regarded the poor with suspicion, disdain, or outright fear. Philanthropy existed, but it was often conditional, tied to moral judgments or religious expectations. Crawlers were marginalized not only by poverty but by perception. They were invisible, in many ways overlooked by those who controlled wealth and power, yet the city's very functioning depended upon their labor, resilience, and ingenuity. The paradox was stark. They were indispensable, yet ignored, essential, yet reviled, struggling to survive, yet possessing skills and wisdom that the privileged rarely acknowledged. There were moments of humanity amidst the struggle. Crawlers formed informal communities, sharing food, information, and protection. They developed codes of behavior, unwritten rules for street conduct, and a rich oral culture of stories, songs, and street knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Festivals, fairs, and occasional public entertainments offered temporary respite from the harshness of life, giving these marginalized communities a chance to celebrate, bond, and experience joy. Humor, music, and storytelling became tools of resilience, allowing crawlers to maintain dignity and hope even in the most trying circumstances. The city itself was both a stage and a character in their lives. The Thames, with its murky waters, was a source of both sustenance and danger. Its wharves and docks teemed with activity, offering work for loaders, scavengers, and those bold enough to ply its edges. Factories and workshops offered employment, but at low pay and under harsh conditions. Markets and streets offered commerce, though competition was fierce, and the risks of theft or exploitation were constant. The architecture of London, with its narrow alleys, hidden courtyards, and labyrinthine streets, shaped crawler life. knowledge of these spaces was power, the ability to navigate, hide, and find resources in this urban maze often determined survival. The crawler's story is also inseparable from the broader transformations of Victorian London. The Industrial Revolution reshaped the city, drawing masses of people from rural areas into urban centers, creating unprecedented opportunities alongside profound suffering. Technological advances, new forms of transportation, and the growth of commerce transformed daily life. Yet for the crawlers, these changes often brought new challenges rather than relief. The streets became more crowded, competition for survival more intense, and the chasm between wealth and poverty ever wider. Yet, amid these challenges, the crawlers endured, leaving traces of their lives that historians and storytellers have slowly uncovered through records, anecdotes, and urban archaeology. To walk the streets as a crawler was to experience life in its rawest form, a constant negotiation between hope and despair, opportunity and danger, survival and moral compromise. It was a life defined not by material wealth, but by resilience, resourcefulness, and an intimate knowledge of the city itself. Crawlers remind us that history is not solely about monarchs, wars, or industrial milestones, but also about ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. Their struggles, triumphs, and failures provide a window into the social, economic, and human realities of one of the world's greatest cities at its most tumultuous and transformative moment. In exploring the lives of the crawlers, we step into a world where every coin mattered, every scrap of food was precious, and every day presented new dangers. We come to appreciate not only their ingenuity and endurance, but also the complex, often invisible structures of Victorian society that shaped their lives. The streets of London, thick with fog, smoke, and human activity, become more than a backdrop. They are an active participant in this story, a living entity that both challenges and sustains those who inhabit it. As we begin to uncover the lives of the crawlers, we see history from the perspective of the marginalized, the overlooked, and the resilient, reminding us that every city has its hidden narratives, and every historical moment carries the imprint of countless human stories, often untold and yet profoundly significant. To understand the crawlers, we must first abandon any modern assumptions about poverty or street life. The streets of Victorian London were not simply places of despair. They were complex ecosystems, teeming with activity, commerce, danger, and survival. Crawlers were the denizens of these spaces, individuals who had learned to navigate a world that the majority of society either ignored or actively sought to regulate and control. Their lives were defined less by their social status and more by their ability to survive day by day, adapting to circumstances that were unpredictable, often brutal, and rarely forgiving. Crawlers were not a homogeneous group. Some were young children, barely able to walk, yet already responsible for gathering food, money, or scraps of material to help sustain their families. These children, often referred to as street urchins or ragamuffins, were everywhere, from the docks along the Thames to the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and the East End. Their small hands might hold a bundle of matches, a collection of nuts or fruit, or trinkets scavenged or sold on credit. They ran errands for shopkeepers, delivered messages for wages, or simply begged for pennies from pedestrians in the streets. But even at such a tender age, they had to learn the rules of the streets, which areas were safe, which adults could be trusted, and which figures were to be feared. A child could not survive long without developing street intelligence and a keen sense of observation, skills that would often determine whether they lived or died. Men who were crawlers were just as varied in their approaches to survival. Some were scavengers, sifting through refuse in alleys or at the riverbanks to collect discarded materials, coal, wood, metal, even clothing, that could be sold or traded. Others took on casual labor, carrying heavy loads for a few pennies or performing odd jobs for local tradesmen. Yet others, when legitimate work proved impossible, turned to petty theft, pickpocketing, or burglary. Crime was not necessarily a moral failing among crawlers. It was a method of survival in a system that offered them few options. For every successful robbery or theft, there were countless failures, beatings, and arrests. Many crawlers developed an intimate knowledge of law enforcement patterns, learning to avoid patrols and slip through the cracks of a legal system designed more to punish than to rehabilitate. Women who lived as crawlers faced their own unique challenges. Single mothers and widows often relied on the street economy to sustain themselves and their children. They sold goods from makeshift stalls, begged, or provided services such as laundry, cleaning, or childcare. The streets could be dangerous for women, particularly at night, when crime and exploitation were rampant. Yet these women exhibited remarkable ingenuity and resilience, devising ways to protect themselves and their children, build informal networks of support, and carve out small spaces of autonomy in a society that sought to limit their opportunities. Many women also participated in family economies that extended across generations, with children contributing to the household income as soon as they were able. The crawler's survival depended not only on skill and resourcefulness, but also on intimate knowledge of the city itself. London was vast and sprawling, with streets that changed dramatically from one neighborhood to the next. The West End boasted elegant townhouses, theaters, and bustling shops, while the East End and Southwark were dominated by narrow alleys, slums, and industrial sites. The Thames, ever present, provided both sustenance and danger. Its wharves were hubs of labor and opportunity, but the river was also treacherous. Children sometimes fell into the water, men drowned while scavenging, and the currents carried disease and filth through the city's arteries. Crawlers had to navigate not just physical dangers, but social ones as well, avoiding patrols, understanding local hierarchies, and negotiating with others in the same struggle for survival. Disease was an ever-present specter. Cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid, and smallpox ran rampant through overcrowded slums. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Many households lacked clean water or proper sewage systems. Inhabitants often shared rooms with strangers, and families sometimes lived in a single room that was home, kitchen, and bedroom combined. Children were particularly vulnerable, and infant mortality rates were shockingly high. Crawlers did not have the luxury of proper medical care. Remedies were improvised, and illness could mean the end of one's ability to earn even the smallest sum of money. Survival required vigilance and adaptability, whether in avoiding disease or in finding clean food and water in an environment where both were scarce. Yet despite these hardships, life among the crawlers was not entirely bleak. Communities formed in the narrow streets and alleys. Families, neighbors, and fellow survivors supported each other, sharing food, information, and protection. Children often formed gangs or groups, watching out for one another and learning the rules of street life collectively. Older crawlers would mentor the younger, teaching them how to navigate dangerous areas, where to find work or food, and how to avoid law enforcement. In many ways, these informal networks functioned as alternative social structures, compensating for the absence of formal support from government or charitable institutions. The economic realities of crawler life were harsh and dictated every decision. Every day was a calculation. how to spend the morning gathering enough to eat, how to trade or sell goods for small profits, how to conserve what little money or resources were available for the night. Some crawlers became highly skilled at navigating these transactions, learning to negotiate with merchants, barter for goods, or trade services for food. Others relied on sheer cunning, knowing when to hide, when to ask, and when to run. The street economy was volatile. Sudden changes, such as a factory strike, a market closure, or even inclement weather, could dramatically affect a crawler's ability to survive. This constant instability forced a mindset of alertness and ingenuity that was unmatched by the more privileged classes. Cultural life among the crawlers was equally fascinating. While poverty imposed severe constraints, it did not eliminate the human need for joy, entertainment, and expression. Crawlers participated in festivals, fairs, and street performances whenever possible. Music, storytelling, and humor were essential coping mechanisms, helping individuals endure harsh conditions. These cultural expressions often carried practical wisdom, cautionary tales, or moral lessons, passed orally from one generation to the next. Songs about the dangers of the river, the tricks of the merchants, or the cruelty of the wealthy were both entertainment and instruction. In the darkness of the alleys, laughter and song became acts of resistance, a way to assert life and humanity against a backdrop of relentless hardship. The social attitudes of Victorian London amplified the challenges faced by crawlers. Society was sharply divided by class, and the wealthy and middle classes often regarded the poor as morally deficient, lazy, or criminal. Philanthropy existed, but it was usually conditional, tied to moral reform or religious instruction, rather than an acknowledgement of systemic inequality. Many charitable institutions sought to impose order and obedience rather than address underlying causes of poverty. Crawlers were forced to navigate not only the physical dangers of their environment, but also the prejudices and expectations of a society that often dehumanized them. They became masters of discretion, learning to move invisibly, avoid scrutiny, and exploit loopholes in social and legal systems to protect themselves and their livelihoods. Crawlers also had to contend with the criminal justice system, which was harsh and unforgiving. Laws against vagrancy, begging, and minor thefts were strictly enforced. Many crawlers spent time in workhouses or were imprisoned for minor offenses, often for acts committed purely to survive. The conditions in these institutions were grim, designed to punish rather than rehabilitate. Yet, even in such oppressive circumstances, crawlers demonstrated resilience, adapting to new environments, learning to navigate authority figures, and finding ways to maintain a sense of dignity and agency. The very architecture of London shaped crawler life. Narrow alleys, hidden courtyards, abandoned warehouses, and rooftop passages were all exploited for survival. Knowledge of these spaces was invaluable. Crawlers learned which streets offered safety, which corners provided opportunities for trade, and which zones were controlled by rival groups. They became intimately familiar with the geography of poverty, turning the city itself into a map of possibilities and threats. This spatial intelligence was as critical to survival as physical strength or cunning. Economic changes brought by the Industrial Revolution intensified both opportunity and danger. Factories and docks provided employment for some, but working conditions were brutal and pay was low. Rapid urbanization increased competition for work, housing, and resources, making survival a constant challenge. Yet even amid these pressures, crawlers carved out niches, leveraging the city's complexity to their advantage. They understood the ebb and flow of urban life in ways that the wealthier classes could scarcely imagine, moving through streets and neighborhoods with agility, intelligence, and purpose. In essence, the crawlers of Victorian London were a testament to human resilience. Their lives were shaped by adversity, yet they exhibited ingenuity, social intelligence, and adaptability that allowed them to survive where others would fail. They navigated a world fraught with physical dangers, disease, economic instability, and social prejudice, relying on skill, community, and streetwise cunning. Their stories, often hidden from history, provide a vivid lens through which to understand the human dimension of one of the world's most dynamic and unequal cities. By examining the lives of these crawlers, we gain insight into the broader realities of Victorian London. We see how poverty, industrialization, and social prejudice intersected to create a world where survival required ingenuity, courage, and relentless determination. We understand that history is not only shaped by monarchs, laws, and inventions, but also by the countless unseen lives that sustained the city, maintained its rhythms, and endured its hardships. Crawlers were not merely survivors, they were witnesses, participants, and contributors to the life of London, leaving an indelible mark on the city's history that we can still trace today in records, literature, and urban memory. The streets of Victorian London were alive in a way that modern cities can scarcely imagine. They were filled with noise, chaos, and movement, a constant symphony of human activity, animal sounds, and mechanical clatter. For the crawlers, these streets were more than just pathways. They were the stage upon which survival played out every day. To walk the streets as a crawler was to understand a world of constant vigilance, improvisation, and adaptation. The very air was thick with smoke, soot, and the pungent odors of a city grappling with industrialization, overcrowding, and human desperation. Gas lamps flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist down the narrow alleys, hiding both danger and opportunity in equal measure. Morning in the crawler's world began not with comfort, but with calculation. The first light revealed a city already bustling. Markets opened, factories let out their workers, and the hum of commerce filled the streets. Crawlers awoke in cramped, often shared accommodations, sometimes a single room divided among several families, sometimes in makeshift shelters in alleys, under staircases, or in abandoned buildings. They had little time for leisure. The day demanded action, and every moment spent idling could mean hunger or exposure to danger. Breakfast, if it existed, was often meager, a crust of bread, perhaps some leftovers, or whatever could be scavenged from the refuse of wealthier neighborhoods. Even children understood the urgency of the morning. The streets were their workplace, and there was no time to lose. The city itself imposed relentless challenges. Cobblestones, uneven and slick with mud and waste, made movement slow and treacherous, particularly for those carrying heavy loads or for children moving quickly to sell their wares. Horses and carts added another layer of danger, as drivers were often impatient, and collisions could be fatal. Beyond these physical hazards, crawlers had to contend with the human element. Street gangs, rival scavengers, and opportunistic criminals all posed threats. One misstep, one moment of inattention, could result in the loss of hard-earned goods or even injury. Survival required a constant awareness of surroundings, quick thinking, and a readiness to react to any situation. The crawler's work was varied, depending on age, strength, and social networks. Young children often sold matches, nuts, fruit, or small trinkets, weaving through crowds with nimbleness that belied their youth. They developed a keen understanding of human behavior, learning which pedestrians were likely to give coins and which would ignore or shoo them away. They memorized the routines of merchants, police patrols, and rival children, creating mental maps of the streets that allowed them to move efficiently and safely. Many children also assisted adults in larger trades, such as carrying coal for local businesses, delivering parcels, or helping with scavenging operations along the riverbanks. Adults engaged in a similarly diverse range of survival strategies. Some were scavengers, combing through refuse, riverbanks, and marketplaces for discarded materials, coal, metal scraps, cloth, or food. These scavengers were often skilled negotiators, trading items for money or services, and had to balance the physical demands of carrying heavy loads with the constant risk of theft or confrontation. Others found employment as porters, factory workers, or casual laborers, often for extremely low wages and in hazardous conditions. Still, others turned to more illicit activities, such as pickpocketing, burglary, or smuggling. Crime was rarely glamorous. It was a practical response to poverty, a method of survival when legitimate work was insufficient or unavailable. Women navigated the streets with a combination of resilience and ingenuity. Many sold small goods from handcarts or makeshift stalls, while others provided domestic services for wealthier households, such as laundry, cleaning, or childcare. Single mothers and widows bore the double burden of providing for their children while defending themselves against the dangers inherent in the streets. They developed informal support networks, sharing resources, information, and protection. Women often relied on their knowledge of social and physical geography to navigate dangerous neighborhoods safely, choosing routes and schedules that minimized exposure to crime or harassment. Disease and illness were constant companions for the crawlers. Cholera outbreaks, tuberculosis, typhoid, and other infectious diseases swept through the crowded slums with alarming speed. Water sources were contaminated, sanitation was minimal, and health care was scarce. Crawlers had to make difficult choices every day. Risk contaminated water or go thirsty, eat questionable food or go hungry, expose themselves to the elements or suffer cold and illness. Children were particularly vulnerable, and many did not survive past early childhood. Adults had to be resourceful, relying on home remedies, herbal treatments, or the charity of neighbors. Illness could mean an abrupt end to one's ability to earn, turning a minor misfortune into a potentially life-threatening situation. Despite these dangers, the crawlers exhibited remarkable resilience. They developed strategies to mitigate risks, protect one another, and exploit opportunities. Street intelligence was invaluable, knowing which alleyways were safe, which areas were controlled by rival groups, and which merchants were likely to be generous or stingy. They learned to read human behavior quickly, judging intentions and making rapid decisions. Even children with their limited physical strength could survive and contribute because they mastered the subtleties of observation, timing, and negotiation. The social networks among crawlers were critical. Communities formed in alleys, slums, and neighborhoods where mutual aid became a form of survival. Families, friends, and fellow crawlers shared food, information, and protection. Older crawlers mentored the young, passing down knowledge about street trades, safety, and strategies for negotiating the city's challenges. These networks provided not only practical support, but also emotional sustenance. In a world of uncertainty and danger, trust and solidarity were lifelines. Daily routines among crawlers were rigorous and dictated by necessity. Morning involved scavenging, trade, or work. Midday brought the bustling chaos of markets and streets, where competition was fierce and vigilance was essential. Evening signaled the approach of darker dangers, crime, cold, and exhaustion. Nighttime required heightened awareness, as darkness amplified both opportunity and risk. Some crawlers ventured out under cover of night to scavenge or steal, while others sought shelter in abandoned buildings, attics, or alleys. The ability to adapt to the changing rhythms of the day was essential for survival. The streets were also theaters of ingenuity. Crawlers devised clever methods to maximize income and minimize danger. Children might distract a passerby to sell a trinket or to create an opening for a parent to scavenge. Adults negotiated barter deals, improvised tools for scavenging, or used misdirection to avoid authority. Even the architecture of London, hidden corners, courtyards, and rooftop passages, became a part of their strategy, providing hiding places, shortcuts, and vantage points. Knowledge of the city's geography was power. Those who mastered it could navigate hazards, find opportunities, and survive where others would fail. Economic pressures shaped every aspect of crawler life. Poverty demanded constant innovation, creativity, and risk-taking. Every coin mattered, every meal required effort. Employment was unstable and wages were low, making every decision a matter of survival. Crawlers had to balance immediate needs against long-term survival, often making difficult choices about how to spend their time, energy, and resources. Competition for work, food, and shelter was intense, and alliances could be as fragile as the resources they depended upon. Despite adversity, moments of humanity and joy persisted. Crawlers found ways to celebrate, bond, and entertain themselves and their communities. Festivals, fairs, and street performances offered temporary respite from the harsh realities of life. Music, storytelling, and humor became essential tools for maintaining morale and sanity. Even in the darkest alleys, laughter, song, and play provided relief and fostered a sense of identity and community. These cultural practices were acts of resistance, affirming life, dignity, and human connection in an environment that often sought to strip them away. Crawlers were also keenly aware of social hierarchies. Victorian society was rigid, and the poor were often stigmatized as morally deficient or lazy. Crawlers learned to navigate these prejudices, sometimes by hiding their poverty, other times by asserting their presence with courage and audacity. They understood how to exploit the behaviors of the wealthy, merchants, and law enforcement to their advantage. These social skills were as vital as physical endurance or resourcefulness, allowing crawlers to maneuver within a system that was largely hostile to them. The city's criminal justice system added another layer of complexity. Laws against vagrancy, begging, and petty theft were strictly enforced. Many crawlers spent time in workhouses or prisons for minor offenses, yet even these institutions could be navigated with skill and cunning. Knowledge of police routines, court procedures, and the behavior of magistrates could mean the difference between release and punishment. Crawlers adapted to these challenges with ingenuity, resilience, and an intimate understanding of the social and legal landscape. Through all these pressures, crawlers demonstrated extraordinary adaptability. Their lives were shaped by constant negotiation with danger, scarcity, and social prejudice. They learned to read their environment with precision, to anticipate threats, and to exploit opportunities. Their survival strategies were multifaceted, encompassing physical skill, social intelligence, emotional resilience, and cultural knowledge. In essence, crawlers were masters of urban survival, capable of thriving in circumstances that would overwhelm most others. By observing their daily routines, struggles, and strategies, we gain insight into the realities of life on the streets of Victorian London. Crawlers were not merely passive victims of circumstance. They were active agents, shaping their own destinies, negotiating opportunities, and asserting agency in a world designed to constrain them. Their experiences illuminate broader social, economic, and cultural patterns, revealing the human dimensions of urbanization, industrialization, and inequality. The streets, with their mud, smoke, and noise, were both a stage and a teacher for crawlers. They imparted lessons in survival, resilience, and cunning, forcing individuals to develop skills that went far beyond physical endurance. Crawlers became astute observers, strategists, and improvisers, constantly learning from experience, from each other, and from the city itself. Their knowledge of the streets was a form of expertise, passed down through generations, often informally, but no less effectively. In conclusion, life on the streets of Victorian London was harsh, unforgiving, and fraught with danger. Yet it was also a realm of creativity, intelligence, and human resilience. Crawlers navigated this world with skill, courage, and ingenuity, demonstrating that even in the bleakest circumstances, human beings find ways to survive, adapt, and assert their presence. By exploring their experiences, we not only gain a deeper understanding of Victorian London, but also recognize the enduring capacity of humans to endure and thrive in adversity. The streets, with all their challenges, become a lens through which we can see the complex interplay of society, survival, and humanity, and the crawlers emerge as emblematic figures of resilience in one of history's most dynamic urban landscapes. Victorian London was a city transformed by industry, commerce, and imperial ambition, yet for those who crawled its streets, these very forces created as much peril as opportunity. The Industrial Revolution had remade the urban landscape, turning London into the beating heart of a global empire, its skyline dominated by factory chimneys and its streets thronged with laborers, merchants, and tradespeople. The roar of machinery, the whistle of steam engines, and the constant movement of goods and people became the rhythm of life, a rhythm that the crawlers learned to navigate with uncanny precision. While the city's wealth expanded rapidly, the benefits were unevenly distributed, leaving the lower classes to contend with overcrowding, disease, and exploitation. In this environment, the crawlers were both observers and participants in a society undergoing profound change, their lives intertwined with the industrial and economic forces that shaped the city. Factories were the most visible symbols of this transformation. Across East London and Southwark, enormous brick buildings belched smoke and steam, their interiors filled with the clatter of machinery and the relentless labor of thousands of workers. Men and women, including children, toiled for long hours under harsh conditions for meager pay. Employment in these factories was a double-edged sword. It offered the promise of income, yet it exacted a heavy toll on health, safety, and family life. Crawlers often had to decide whether to accept such labor, knowing that while it could provide temporary relief from hunger, it might also lead to injury, exhaustion, or illness. Those who could not secure factory work relied on the streets, scavenging and trading, turning the urban environment itself into a site of labor and survival. The docks along the Thames were another critical component of the industrial city, teeming with activity and danger alike. Ships unloaded goods from around the world, sacks of coal, barrels of food, crates of textiles, while longshoremen, laborers, and scavengers moved among them. Crawlers, particularly men, were drawn to these areas for opportunities to earn, scavenge, or trade. The docks were dangerous places with heavy cargo, swift tides, and the constant risk of injury, yet they were also rich with opportunity. Coal dust, broken crates, discarded goods, and unguarded shipments could all be turned into resources. Crawlers developed intimate knowledge of the ebb and flow of the docks, understanding when ships would arrive, how long goods would remain unattended, and how to avoid both authority figures and rival scavengers. The Industrial Revolution also reshaped housing, creating vast slums in which the crawlers lived. The influx of rural populations seeking work in London led to overcrowding, with families crammed into single rooms or subdivided houses. These areas were often poorly constructed, lacking proper sanitation, ventilation, or clean water. Disease spread rapidly, and fires could consume entire blocks in moments, Crawlers adapted to these conditions with ingenuity, finding makeshift solutions for cooking, heating, and shelter. Yet the hardships were constant, and life in these slums demanded resilience, creativity, and cooperation. Neighbors relied on one another, sharing scarce resources, protecting children, and providing information about dangers or opportunities in the wider city. The social fabric of Victorian London was deeply influenced by these industrial changes. Economic inequality was stark, with the upper classes enjoying opulent townhouses, fine clothing, and leisure, while the poor struggled in overcrowded tenements. Crawlers experienced this inequality firsthand. They could see the wealth that surrounded them, the carriages, shops, and theaters of the West End, yet this wealth was largely inaccessible. The contrast was not merely material, it was psychological. Crawlers learned to navigate a world in which the city's wealth coexisted with extreme deprivation, shaping both their expectations and strategies for survival. Employment patterns were also reshaped by industrialization. Traditional trades, crafts, and small-scale agriculture declined, replaced by factory work, casual labor, and a growing informal economy. Crawlers were adept at exploiting these new patterns. They became flexible, learning to move between jobs, trades, and scavenging opportunities as conditions changed. Some crawlers specialized in particular forms of work, delivering parcels, carrying coal, or selling specific goods, while others maintained a more generalist approach, ready to seize any opportunity that arose. This adaptability was crucial in a city where economic conditions could shift overnight, and where industrialization brought both boom and bust to neighborhoods across London. The streets themselves were reshaped by industrialization. Narrow alleys and crowded thoroughfares were filled with carts, horses, and pedestrians, creating a chaotic environment that demanded constant vigilance. Crawlers learned to read the flow of traffic, anticipate hazards, and exploit gaps in the movement of people and goods. They became experts in timing, speed, and observation, using these skills to sell wares, collect scraps, or avoid confrontation. The very architecture of London, the hidden corners, courtyards, and rooftops, became part of their strategy, providing vantage points, shortcuts, and places to hide. Urban space was not neutral. It was a dynamic environment that shaped, constrained, and facilitated the lives of those who crawled within it. Industrialization also affected family and social structures. The demands of factory work, irregular employment, and urban migration disrupted traditional patterns of kinship and community. Crawlers often relied on extended networks of neighbors, friends, and fellow survivors to compensate for the absence of stable family structures. Children worked alongside parents or guardians, learning skills necessary for survival and contributing to household income. Communities formed around shared experiences of hardship, creating informal systems of support, protection, and social cohesion. These networks were critical for navigating the dangers of the streets, the instability of employment, and the threats posed by disease and crime. The industrial city also fostered new forms of commerce and opportunity. Markets, shops, and street vendors created spaces for crawlers to trade, sell goods, or perform services. Children sold matches, nuts, or trinkets. Women bartered household items or offered domestic labor. Men scavenged materials or carried goods for hire. Crawlers developed acute social intelligence, learning to negotiate, assess demand, and understand human behavior. These skills were as vital as physical strength or endurance, allowing crawlers to thrive in an environment where resources were scarce and competition was fierce. Industrialization heightened social tensions. Economic inequality, overcrowding, and the visibility of wealth created resentment, conflict, and social unrest. Crawlers were often caught in the crossfire, targeted by law enforcement, exploited by employers, or attacked by rival groups. Yet these challenges also fostered resilience and adaptability. Crawlers learned to navigate social hierarchies, exploit opportunities, and create informal rules of engagement within their communities. They became adept at balancing cooperation with competition, trust with caution, and risk with reward. Education was a rare luxury for crawlers. While some charitable schools existed, many children had no access to formal learning, instead acquiring knowledge through observation, experience, and oral tradition. They learned arithmetic through trade, geography through navigation of the streets, and social norms through interaction with adults and peers. Storytelling, songs, and street wisdom transmitted practical knowledge, moral lessons, and cultural values. In this way, the streets themselves became classrooms, shaping skills, intelligence, and understanding in ways that formal institutions could not. The psychological impact of industrialization on crawlers was profound. The constant exposure to poverty, danger, and inequality shaped perceptions, behaviors, and worldviews. Crawlers became vigilant, resourceful, and wary, developing a deep understanding of risk, reward, and human nature. Yet they also exhibited remarkable creativity, humor, and resilience. Even amid hardship, crawlers found ways to celebrate, form bonds, and assert identity. These psychological and social adaptations were crucial for navigating the complexities of industrial London, and ensured that crawlers could endure in an environment that was often hostile and unforgiving. Industrialization also introduced new technologies and transportation systems, which shaped crawler life. Steam engines, trams, and railways transformed the movement of goods and people, creating both opportunities and challenges. Crawlers learned to exploit these systems, scavenging along railway lines, transporting goods for hire, or using elevated tracks and rooftops for safe passage. The city's infrastructure became both a resource and a constraint, requiring intimate knowledge and constant adaptation. Crawlers who mastered these urban systems could access income, food, and shelter more efficiently, while those who failed faced increased risk and deprivation. The environmental impact of industrialization was equally significant. Air pollution, contaminated water, and industrial waste created a hazardous living environment. Crawlers developed strategies to mitigate these risks, from avoiding polluted water sources to navigating streets with cleaner air or safer footing. Their bodies and senses adapted to the harsh conditions, and their knowledge of the environment became a critical survival tool. These adaptations were learned and transmitted within communities, forming part of the collective intelligence of the crawlers. Despite the hardships, the industrial city also offered moments of opportunity and advancement. Crawlers could leverage their skills, intelligence, and street knowledge to gain income, social recognition within their communities, or access to safer living conditions. Some managed to transition from the margins into more stable forms of employment, while others found niches in the informal economy that provided relative security. These successes, however small, were vital for sustaining morale and demonstrating the possibility of agency within a system that was often overwhelmingly oppressive. The industrial shadow also cast a moral dimension over crawler life. Victorian society emphasized discipline, work ethic, and moral rectitude. Yet the economic and social realities often forced crawlers into morally ambiguous choices. Scavenging, petty theft, or deceptive trade practices were sometimes necessary for survival, challenging societal definitions of right and wrong. Crawlers navigated these moral landscapes with pragmatism and intelligence, balancing ethical considerations with the imperative of survival. In this way, industrialization not only shaped the physical and economic environment, but also influenced the ethical and social framework within which crawlers operated. By examining the lives of crawlers under the industrial shadow, we gain insight into the human dimension of technological and economic transformation. Industrialization was not merely a story of machines, factories, or commerce. It was a story of adaptation, resilience, and survival. Crawlers exemplify the human capacity to endure, innovate, and thrive amid change and adversity. Their experiences illuminate the complex interplay between social structures, economic forces, and individual agency, revealing the profound impact of industrialization on everyday life in Victorian London. In essence, the industrial shadow of Victorian London created a world of contrasts: wealth and poverty, opportunity and danger, progress and deprivation. Crawlers lived at the intersection of these forces, negotiating survival in a city transformed by industry and empire. They were both witnesses and participants, shaping and being shaped by the urban environment, economic structures, and social hierarchies. Their stories remind us that history is not only measured by grand events, inventions, or leaders, but also by the experiences of those who lived, struggled, and endured in the spaces between. Through their resilience, ingenuity, and adaptability, crawlers offer a window into the lived reality of Victorian London. They demonstrate the human capacity to survive and thrive in adversity, to navigate complex social and economic landscapes, and to assert agency within oppressive systems. By understanding the industrial shadow and its impact on crawler life, we gain a richer, more nuanced appreciation of the city's history, the forces that shaped it, and the people who inhabited its streets. Crawlers, often overlooked in historical accounts, emerge as central figures in the story of London's transformation, a testament to human endurance, creativity, and resilience in one of the most dynamic periods of urban history. The streets of Victorian London were alive with stories of hardship, ingenuity, courage, and survival. For the crawlers, every corner, alleyway, and marketplace held a tale, often both heartbreaking and inspiring. To walk among them was to witness the constant negotiation between opportunity and danger, a delicate dance where one misstep could result in loss, injury, or even death. Yet amid this struggle, the crawlers demonstrated resilience, creativity, and social intelligence, leaving behind a rich tapestry of experiences that reflect the complexity of urban life in 19th century London. Children's stories were among the most vivid and poignant. Street urchins, some no older than 6 or 7, were expected to contribute to family income, often by selling matches, nuts, fruit, or small trinkets. These young crawlers became adept observers of human behavior, learning to recognize generosity, impatience, and indifference in the pedestrians who passed by. They memorized the routines of shopkeepers, the schedules of patrols, and the patterns of rival children, developing a mental map of the city that allowed them to move with agility and safety. One child might sell matches to a distracted pedestrian, while another quietly retrieved discarded scraps of coal or wood for the family hearth. Survival required a combination of intelligence, courage, and speed. Mistakes could be costly. A misjudged alley, a misplaced step, or an encounter with a gang of older children could result in lost goods, injury, or punishment. Adult crawlers also faced constant challenges and dangers, yet their stories reveal remarkable ingenuity. Men scavenged along the Thames, sifting through refuse and debris for valuable materials, while women sold goods or performed services in crowded streets and markets. Some crawlers became skilled negotiators, trading scraps, commodities, or favors with shopkeepers and merchants. Others relied on cunning, to navigate the risks of petty theft, pickpocketing, or smuggling. Survival was a daily negotiation requiring physical strength, alertness, and social acumen. Crawlers learned to exploit weaknesses in authority, humanize interactions with potential allies, and avoid those who posed threats. Their lives were defined by the constant balancing of risk and reward, and their strategies evolved with experience, observation, and necessity. Disease and illness added another layer of peril to crawler life. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and smallpox were rampant, particularly in overcrowded slums and poorly sanitized streets. Access to clean water and medical care was limited, forcing crawlers to improvise remedies or rely on herbal treatments. Illness could abruptly end a crawler's ability to work, leaving families vulnerable to hunger and exposure. Many crawlers developed strategies to mitigate these risks, such as knowing which water sources were safer, avoiding particularly unsanitary areas, and caring for children in ways that reduced the likelihood of infection. Yet, despite all precautions, the presence of disease shaped daily routines, decisions, and interactions, adding a constant undercurrent of anxiety to everyday life. Crime and violence were ever-present threats. Rival groups of crawlers, gangs, and opportunistic criminals all competed for resources and territory. Stories abound of confrontations in alleyways, disputes over scavenged materials, and thefts that escalated into violent encounters. Children often had to defend themselves or flee from older, stronger opponents, while adults navigated complex social dynamics to avoid conflict. Authority figures, police officers, constables, and workhouse supervisors added another layer of danger. Crawlers learned to read patterns, anticipate enforcement, and exploit gaps in oversight to protect themselves and their resources. These encounters required quick thinking, physical dexterity, and an acute understanding of social cues. Amid these challenges, crawlers developed remarkable ingenuity. Street urchins created diversion tactics to sell their goods or retrieve items unnoticed. Adults devised methods for scavenging efficiently, using simple tools or improvised techniques to access valuable materials. Women leveraged social networks and interpersonal skills to trade goods, negotiate prices, and safeguard themselves. These strategies reflected a sophisticated understanding of the urban environment, human behavior, and economic systems. Crawlers were not merely reacting to circumstances. They were actively shaping their environment, manipulating opportunities, and asserting agency in a world designed to constrain them. Stories of courage and resilience are especially striking. Children who ventured onto the docks risked injury or drowning to collect scraps of coal or discarded goods, contributing to their family's survival. Women navigating crowded streets and marketplaces developed skills in negotiation, self-defense, and improvisation to protect themselves and their children. Men scavenging along the Thames or in factory districts faced physical hazards and potential arrest, yet continued because survival demanded it. These narratives highlight the determination, creativity, and moral complexity that defined crawler life. The crawler's ingenuity extended to social organization. Communities formed around shared experience, providing mutual aid, protection, and information. Older crawlers mentored younger ones, teaching essential skills for survival, such as recognizing safe routes, assessing human behavior, and negotiating trade. These informal networks were crucial for safety, social cohesion, and the transmission of knowledge. Within these communities, crawlers developed shared norms, unwritten rules, and cultural practices that facilitated cooperation and resilience. Festivals, street performances, and collective celebrations offered temporary relief, reinforcing social bonds and providing moments of joy amidst hardship. the psychological dimension of crawler life is equally compelling. Constant exposure to danger, scarcity, and social prejudice shaped attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors. Crawlers became vigilant, adaptive, and socially intelligent, capable of reading situations, anticipating threats, and making rapid decisions. Yet they also displayed creativity, humor, and empathy, finding ways to maintain identity, dignity, and community in a harsh environment. Stories of generosity, mentorship, and mutual aid highlight the enduring human capacity for cooperation and compassion, even in circumstances of extreme deprivation. Interactions with the wider society added complexity to crawler life. The wealthy and middle classes often viewed crawlers with disdain or fear, reinforcing social hierarchies and limiting access to resources. Philanthropy existed, but it was conditional, emphasizing moral reform rather than systemic support. Crawlers navigated these dynamics with skill, using discretion, deception, or strategic engagement to gain resources or avoid conflict. They learned which individuals or institutions could provide assistance, which neighborhoods offered opportunity or safety, and how to present themselves in ways that maximized advantage while minimizing risk. Historical records provide glimpses into these lives through court documents, workhouse records, newspaper accounts, and personal memoirs. These sources reveal a society struggling to manage poverty and social change, often through punitive measures rather than support. Crawlers, in turn, developed adaptive strategies to survive within these constraints, demonstrating resilience, intelligence, and agency. Their experiences challenge simplistic narratives of Victorian poverty, revealing a complex interplay of economic necessity, social structure, and human ingenuity. The environment of Victorian London itself played a crucial role in shaping crawler experiences. Narrow alleys, courtyards, docks, and rooftops provided both hazards and opportunities. Knowledge of these spaces allowed crawlers to move efficiently, evade danger, and access resources. The city became an extension of their cognitive map, where spatial intelligence was as critical as physical endurance. Crawlers learned to anticipate hazards, recognize patterns, and exploit urban features to their advantage. The city's very architecture shaped their strategies, routines, and social interactions, making urban space an active participant in their lives. Economic pressures dictated the rhythm of crawler life. Daily decisions revolved around securing food, income, and shelter. Employment was often temporary, irregular, and low-paying, making flexibility essential. Crawlers adapted by maintaining diverse skills, developing informal trade networks, and exploiting opportunities as they arose. These adaptive strategies were not static. They evolved with experience, social changes, and shifts in the urban environment. Crawlers became skilled negotiators of both material and social resources, balancing risk, reward, and survival in a constantly changing landscape. Amid danger and scarcity, crawlers cultivated cultural and emotional resilience. Storytelling, music, and humor were essential tools for coping with adversity. These practices reinforced community bonds, transmitted knowledge, and provided moments of relief from daily struggle. Festivals, fairs, and street performances offered temporary escapes, allowing crawlers to experience joy, creativity, and social connection. Even in the harshest circumstances, these cultural expressions demonstrated the enduring human need for meaning, community, and celebration. The stories from the streets also reveal moral complexity. Crawlers navigated a world where conventional notions of right and wrong were often inadequate. survival sometimes required deception, theft, or risk-taking that conflicted with societal norms. Crawlers balanced ethical considerations with practical necessity, demonstrating a pragmatic morality shaped by circumstance rather than ideology. Their choices reflect the human capacity to adapt ethical frameworks to challenging environments, revealing insight into the interplay between morality, survival, and social constraint. Stories of heroism, ingenuity, and endurance emerge alongside narratives of tragedy, loss, and suffering. Children who survived harsh winters, women who defended their families, and men who navigated the docks or alleys exemplify courage in the face of adversity. Conversely, disease, injury, and social neglect often brought abrupt calamity, highlighting the fragility of life on the streets. Together, these stories create a rich mosaic of human experience, revealing both the resilience and vulnerability of those who lived as crawlers. By examining these narratives, we gain a deeper understanding of Victorian London beyond statistics or grand historical events. The city was not merely a backdrop, it was an active participant in shaping human experience. Crawlers, through their struggles, strategies, and resilience, illuminate the social, economic, and cultural dynamics of the urban environment. Their lives provide insight into the impact of industrialization, urbanization, and social inequality on ordinary people, highlighting the complex interplay between environment, society, and individual agency. Ultimately, the stories from the streets of Victorian London reveal the remarkable capacity of humans to endure, adapt, and assert agency under extreme conditions. Crawlers demonstrate intelligence, resilience, and creativity, navigating a world shaped by poverty, disease, danger, and inequality. Their experiences offer a lens through which we can understand the lived reality of one of history's most dynamic and unequal cities, reminding us that history is composed not only of leaders, events, or inventions, but also of the countless lives lived, struggled, and endured in the shadows. Through the tales of crawlers, we witness the humanity that persisted despite adversity, the resourcefulness of children, the courage of adults, the solidarity of communities, and the creativity of cultural expression. These narratives enrich our understanding of Victorian London, offering vivid insight into the lived experiences of those who existed on the margins, yet shaped the city in profound ways. They remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, resilience, ingenuity, and human connection endure, leaving traces that continue to inform our understanding of the past. As the sun sets over Victorian London, casting long shadows across the cobblestones and alleyways, we begin to reflect on the lives of those who crawled its streets, the young, the old, men, women, and children who navigated a city defined by extremes of wealth and poverty, opportunity and danger. These crawlers were more than mere survivors. They were witnesses to one of the most transformative eras in urban history and participants in a daily struggle that demanded ingenuity, resilience, and courage. To truly understand their lives is to gain a window into the social, economic, and cultural fabric of 19th century London, and to appreciate the enduring human capacity to adapt, endure, and even flourish under adversity. The legacy of the crawlers is inseparable from the environment that shaped them. Victorian London was a city of contrasts. The grandeur of the West End with its theatres and townhouses, the bustling markets and factories of the East End, and the shadowy alleys and riverbanks where poverty was most visible. Industrialization and urbanization brought wealth, innovation, and opportunity, but also disease, overcrowding, and exploitation. Crawlers lived at the intersection of these forces, navigating a world that was both physically dangerous and socially complex. Every day, They had to negotiate space, resources, and relationships, balancing the immediate demands of survival against the long-term challenges of an unforgiving city. Reflecting on their daily lives, we see the extraordinary skill and intelligence that crawlers developed. Children sold goods with astonishing shrewdness, understanding the psychology of passers-by and mastering the flow of human traffic. Adults scavenged along the Thames, negotiated with merchants, or performed labor that required both physical endurance and strategic thinking. Women navigated markets, social networks, and the hazards of public life with ingenuity and courage, protecting their families while maintaining economic activity. Every crawler developed a unique set of skills, blending observation, negotiation, resourcefulness, and courage, which allowed them to survive, and sometimes even thrive in conditions that were perilous and often dehumanizing. The stories of the crawlers also reveal the social structures that emerged in response to adversity. Communities formed in alleys, courtyards, and slums, creating networks of mutual aid, mentorship, and protection. Older crawlers taught the younger, sharing practical knowledge about survival, trade, and navigation of the city. Families relied on one another, pooling scarce resources, and developing informal systems to provide for children and the elderly. These social networks were essential not only for practical survival, but also for emotional support and identity formation. Even in a world marked by scarcity and danger, human connection remained vital, providing a source of resilience, continuity, and hope. Disease, poverty, and danger shaped crawler life in profound ways. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and other illnesses were ever-present threats, and medical care was often inaccessible. Hunger, exposure to the elements, and physical hazards compounded the challenges of survival. Yet, despite these threats, crawlers exhibited remarkable adaptability. They learned to avoid danger, make efficient use of resources, and support one another through illness and scarcity. These strategies were not merely reactive. They were the product of observation, experience, and cultural knowledge passed down through generations. Survival required not only physical endurance, but also cognitive, social, and emotional intelligence. The industrial shadow cast by factories, docks, and railways both constrained and facilitated crawler life. Factories offered employment, albeit dangerous and low-paid, while the docks provided opportunities for scavenging and casual labor. The rhythms of industry shaped the daily schedules of crawlers, dictating when work was available, when streets were crowded, and when risks were highest. Crawlers learned to interpret these rhythms, aligning their activities with the opportunities and hazards presented by industrial life. Their knowledge of the city was not abstract, it was intensely practical, guiding decisions about movement, trade, and survival in real time. The moral dimension of crawler life is equally compelling. Survival often required actions that conflicted with societal notions of right and wrong. Scavenging, petty theft, or deception were sometimes necessary to feed a family or protect a child. Crawlers navigated these ethical landscapes with pragmatism, balancing the imperatives of survival with social expectations and personal values. Their choices highlight the complexity of human morality under conditions of scarcity and danger, revealing a nuanced understanding of ethics shaped by circumstance rather than ideology. Cultural life, too, persisted in the margins. Despite poverty and danger, crawlers created spaces for expression, play, and community. Music, storytelling, festivals, and street performances provided moments of joy, solidarity, and identity. Children played games in alleys and courtyards, while adults shared news, gossip, and practical wisdom. Humor, song, and narrative became essential coping mechanisms, reinforcing resilience and social cohesion. These cultural practices demonstrate that even in the harshest conditions, human creativity and the need for social connection endure. The psychological resource